to today's topic, we are going to be talking about biological soil amendments of animal origin, all things poop. So if you remember from the produce safety rule training, the farms do have flexibility in which types of biological soil amendments they're able to use and apply to their crops, but it can be daunting to try and think about what sort of risk assessments you have to make to determine the right strategy, if you're going to make compost, when you're going to apply certain things, how you're going to store it and handle it. So our hosts today are going to touch on all of that. First, I would like to introduce Sarah Everhart. She is a senior legal specialist at the Agricultural Law Education Initiative at the University of Maryland Francis Carey School of Law. She's a graduate of Washington College and a cum laude graduate of Elizabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University. She practiced law in Maryland for 9 years prior to joining ALEI, and Sarah also sits on the Talbot County Soil Conservation Board of Supervisors. Our co-presenter today, we are very excited to bring in our composting expert, Dave Myers from University of Maryland Extension. Dave is a principal agent in Anne Arundel and Prince George's counties. Prior to assuming the University of Maryland Extension position, Mr. Myers was the agronomist for the U.S. Naval Academy Dairy Farm, and while working at the Naval Academy Dairy, he earned a BS in agronomy and crop science and a master's degree in agronomy and weed science from the University of Maryland. His extension responsibilities include all field crop and livestock agriculture with an emphasis on fruit and veg production and pesticide use and safety. So without further ado, Sarah, go ahead, get started.
Thanks, Angela. Welcome, everybody. Get my slides moving here. So in case you're not familiar with the Ag Law Education Initiative, we're a group of attorneys, and our job is to provide legal education and outreach throughout the state on a variety of different topics. There's our website below. It's umaglaw.org. If you've never checked it out, I encourage you to do so and take advantage of our resources. While I have some of you today, I want to do a shameless plug for an upcoming event. This is our big annual event every year. It's an agricultural and environmental law conference. This year, it's going to be online on a series of Mondays in November, which is fast approaching. So November 2nd, November 9th, and November 16th from 2 to 4. There'll be 2 webinars each afternoon, and select webinars will qualify for nutrient management continuing ed credit. Registration is free, and so I think Angela's going to pop that registration link in the chat box for you. I'm sure you'll probably find at least one of the webinars of interest to you. I encourage you to register. Quickly wanted to mention that the Maryland Food Safety Network that Angela was referring to, very much a collaborative effort. So we've got experts from Department of Ag, experts from University of Maryland Extension, scientists from College Park, like Angela. We work really hard to make sure that all of our education is helpful and dynamic for all of you. If there's any suggestions or topics that you would like us to cover, please be in touch with us. We are supported in part by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Just a disclaimer, I am an attorney. We are going to be talking about some legal requirements today, but I'm not here providing legal advice. I'm just here providing legal education. If you have legal questions, please consult your individual attorney. Okay, so let's get down to it. Biological soil amendments of animal origin. Probably not a phrase that most farmers are accustomed to using. So what are we talking about? Basically, we're talking about anything in whole or in part that's made of animal byproducts. Things like manure, bone meal, that type of thing. Not including human waste. So when we talk about biological soil amendments of animal origin, we're not including human waste. I will touch on biosolids here in a second, but that's basically what we're talking about today, and that's what's covered by the produce safety rule. Important to say at the outset that the produce safety rule does not discourage farmers from using biological soil amendments, and we don't want to do that either. What we hope to do today is just to give you some information, legal, scientific information, to help you to better use these products on your farm. We know that they're a valuable tool and that many folks have used them for a long time. And so we just want to give you some tips, some resources to safely use them and to be able to use them in compliance with the law. Why this is in the produce safety rule is because although these things can be valuable on the farm, they can also present some risks. So there are some pathogens within these biological soil amendments of animal origin that have the potential to cause contamination and cause foodborne illness. And so that's something that obviously we want to try to avoid. What the rule covers is basically how farmers need to handle, convey, and store these soil amendments. They have to do those things in a way that does not contribute to contamination. So the main things that you need to worry about are that these amendments don't contaminate covered produce, don't contaminate food contact surfaces, and that's any kind of a surface where covered produce is going to be coming in contact. So areas used for a covered activity, now that's what it says in the law, but what that really means is areas where you're growing, holding, or packing produce. Water sources and systems, and then other soil amendments. So let's start with storage. Storage of these soil amendments is an extremely important part of all this. We know that you have to have these on the farm, and you have to have these someplace where they're going to be accessible to your produce growing areas. So accessibility is an important part of this. And, we're not advocating that you store these in, a far off corner of the farm that's going to make your life much more difficult. But think about all these other components when you think about locating or possibly relocating, if you think that's necessary, your storage area. You're going to want to separate treated and untreated soil amendments. So if you have treated soil amendments, whether you're buying those from a third party or whether you're treating on the farm yourself, definitely going to want to store treated soil amendments separate from untreated. If you contaminate the two, you just have untreated soil amendments. You won't have anything that's considered treated anymore. And you obviously, if you've got other folks working with you on the farm, you want to try to eliminate any chance of confusion with people cross-contaminating between those two types. Think about, and I know this probably, it's a very rainy day today, and we've had a rainy couple of years here in our area on the Delmarva, so this isn't too difficult to think about, but you want to think about what areas of your farm are particularly flood prone, what's going to happen to the storage area if we get inundated with a lot of rain. We all know that water can carry contamination very quickly, and so we don't want to store in an area that's a particularly wet part of the farm. Want to try to minimize runoff from these areas. So not putting them in a steep part of the farm if you've got some rolling hills where you're located. Not required, but recommended to keep the pile under cover. And that's for a couple different reasons. It's going to help prevent runoff during a rain event. It's also going to help prevent spreading during windy events. And it's going to prevent, or maybe minimize, and it's hard to prevent wildlife from doing much of anything, but it's going to help reduce the chance of wildlife getting into these soil amendment areas and then tracking that potential contamination into other parts of your farm. Another recommendation to consider is if there's a way to direct drainage from your storage area to, say, a vegetated buffer or another area, maybe you have a wooded area that's going to separate the storage area from the produce area. Think about if you can redirect that drainage so that the buffer can capture some of that. Anything to slow that water down running from the soil amendment area to the produce field is going to help. And also redirecting roof runoff. So if your storage area is near corner of an outbuilding, maybe you could redirect that roof runoff so it's not pouring directly onto that storage area. And then also being cognizant of local setback guidelines. Wanted to go over this briefly. So just a few Maryland specific rules that the Maryland Department of Agriculture recommended we include in this presentation. So in Maryland, you can compost up to 5,000 square feet without a permit from the Maryland Department of Environment. That's who's going to regulate on-farm composting. However, Compost needs to be included in your nutrient management plan and applied in accordance with the plan. The stockpiles do not need to be covered. So again, that was a recommendation, not a requirement that I was just talking about, but need to be 5 to 6 feet tall and shaped to shed water. Temporary stockpiles can be in the field for up to a year. They have to be spread in the spring of the following year of the stock that the stockpile had started, and then be cognizant of your winter prohibitions for application from December to March, and think about all of that and along with everything else we're talking about here today. So I'm going to hand it off to Dave to give us some information about how to make safe compost.
Thanks, Sarah. Hey, great greetings to everyone. Glad to be part of this today. And I'm thinking about, compost and how important it is. And I was just doing a little figuring in my head. I remember when I was a dairy farmer that my boss came to me, the manager. I was the agronomist in the farm, and he was the farm manager. And he came to me and said, "We've got to reduce the fertilizer bill." And we weren't really taking into account the value of that manure that we were spreading out there. So I real quickly valued that manure and saved $25,000 to $30,000 annually in fertilizer for the farm. So it's very valuable. It's very important to use. It also is it's excellent source for the complete nutrient complex for plant growth. And so those 13 essential plant growth minerals are available in that compost. So we know how valuable this product is. And the point now is to make sure that we apply it in such a way that it's safe to our produce. And it's not uncommon in Maryland for our produce farms to maybe also have livestock. And so our small farm operations are very diverse, and they may have cattle, sheep, goats, chickens, along with the produce. And so sanitation is very critical, and it's always a concern of disease spread on the farm. Also, composting is a great way and to control flies and odor. And so why not do it, right? And so a lot of times our fields are only really ready for compost or manure applications in that spring, early spring or late fall period when we're in that transition period too. So by composting, we have a product that's very stable. We've controlled the odor. We have controlled the flies and disease, and then we can safely apply it according to the produce safety rule. So let's think about compost. What are we really trying to do? And here's a guide here, a recommended on-farm composting guide from Virginia Tech, that if you haven't seen this guide, I've taken some excerpts from that, which also they have excerpted from the NRA's Ag Engineering publications. And so a few slides that I want to share with you today, I think will help us really kind of understand composting and in a very quick fashion. So we're taking this organic matter and typically we're trying to bring it to a certain temperature with a certain amount of water, and we're going to oxygenate it in such a way that we end up with a very nice finished product. And so let's go to that next slide, Sarah, and let's talk about exactly what these finished products would look like and how we can make sure that we're doing it properly. The compost standards. So here, if you look at that kind of that Fahrenheit Celsius range over there, you see that we're really trying to get into that thermophilic range of bacteria and fungi. And these are heat lovers, right? And they're going to actually be with oxygen and oxygenated organic matter, and of course the right amount of water and the right nutrient amounts available. We should see a proliferation of these thermophils. And when we see that, we're probably going to see that heat quickly and rapidly rise up into that range that we're looking for. Stable composting must have and maintain aerobic conditions, oxygen, so stirring is required, minimum of 130 degree Fahrenheit for 3 consecutive days. And if you look at that range there, we're going to effectively control the pathogenic diseases at that point. That 3 days at 131 degrees is all it takes if it's throughout the entirety of that pile. And that's why stirring is very important to this pile. And it can be somewhat passive. When I was dairy farming, we have about 600-ton pile out there that we would accumulate to be spread in the spring and fall. And we took a large loader and we manipulated the pile, constantly kind of turned it in on itself. And we were able to easily maintain that heat. Turn composting maintains aerobic conditions at a minimum of 15 days. So when you're doing that turning, especially thoroughly turning, maybe less than passive, you need to have 15 consecutive days, a minimum of 5 turnings. And it's at the point where when you turn that the heat really doesn't rise anymore, that you have a full, that's an indication that you have effectively have composted that material. So let's go ahead, and you'll also notice that we can reach much higher temperatures than 131. It's not uncommon to get up there to even kill weed seed. And so that should be a goal also, to go beyond just that pathogenic destruction temperature and get up to where you can actually destroy maybe even weeds. And I think that's a very important part of composting too. And so go ahead and next slide, Sarah. So here's what's going to really help us develop a real quality compost, and is to make sure that we have these certain characteristics of the material that we're, and the ability to move and manipulate the pile to keep it in these ranges. Initially, we want a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 20:1 to 40:1, with the most optimum range being 25:1 to 30. We'll see a slide here and show us how we can get to that. But just keep in mind, acceptable range is 20 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen to 40 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen of the material that you're trying to compost. The optimum range would be right in that sweet spot of around 25:1 or 30:1. Temperature is where we're going to be moving, in the acceptable range. You really are have a thermophilic composting going on when you get to 110 and above, and that 110 to 150 is kind of considered acceptable. Our goal is to get to 131. Remember, by law we have to get there. So the optimum range then is that 120 to 140. So we move the pile based on temperature, manipulate that pile to maintain and to move that material so that all of it is thoroughly composted. And of course, that's done over a period of maybe 6 months if it's a large pile, or maybe a smaller pile could be done quicker. Moisture content, 45 to 65%, with that ideal and optimum being around 50 to 60% water. So that's a lot of moisture. So we want this to be not so saturated. We wouldn't want it wetter than that, because it becomes saturated and more likely to not have enough oxygen. The oxygen we're shooting for is around 5% saturation of oxygen within that pile all the time. That's the continual moving to keep it aerobic. We don't want it to go anaerobic. We want aerobic composting. Particle size, it can really vary based upon the pile size, but ideally when the finished product, you want it fairly friable and almost soil-like in condition. Around that half-inch particle size would be, I'd say 1/2 to 1 inch. Would probably be where you're mostly likely to end up with most manures. Unless it's poultry litter, you're going to end up probably in that 1/8 to 1/2 inch size. And bulk density ranges too can be a measurement of that. Sarah, next slide. So here's actually I took that photo of the composting pile at the Naval Academy Dairy Farm years ago. So that was after we were cleaning out. We had a couple different piles, probably within that footprint of about 50 by 100 feet, which is at 5,000 square foot, which contained about 600 tons of manure, spread 10 tons per acre on 100 acres, on 60 acres, and we pretty much handled that pile. Like I said, almost saved my salary in just reduction of fertilizer bills with compost of the manure generated at the farm. Here's a really good slide here. It's kind of busy, kind of small, but it does show you that carbon to nitrogen ratio. Remember, we want to get to that 25:1, maybe 30:1 sweet spot of carbon to nitrogen. And so we can do that by making sure the materials we're putting in the pile blended in such a fashion to get us there. You see the hay is kind of already in that sweet spot. Straw is down there around 80:1. Shavings is way up there, so you're going to be really careful with especially sawdust and shavings, but maybe straw and some manure and some vegetable waste and pure manure coming out of the tail end, right? That's probably what you're going to be mixing, and eventually get to that sweet spot of around 25 to 30:1. Of course, moisture is something that has to be constantly monitored. I have seen the piles that shed water. Some people will, if they're moisture deficient, will actually put a conical depression in the top to actually catch moisture in the pile itself. It's not uncommon for large piles to actually give off quite a bit of water vapor and actually need additional moisture. Of course, like Sarah has said, we certainly have had our rainfall which exceeded most people's expectations here the last couple of years. Of course, the bulk density measurements are important too as you're getting your finish. to kind of have a good, fair assessment of how well you've done as a composter. Remember, composting, to be done correctly by law and to use, I know Sarah's going to get into that, has to meet certain criteria, and they're typically going to be required to be certified as having gone through these processes correctly. So sanitation, disease management on the farm, and of course, when we use this product for our produce, is so critical. Fly control is absolutely critical. Odor control, great reasons to compost our products out there, passive or very actively, and meet those criteria. And we are mitigating risk. There's no doubt in our minds, and it's a very valuable product. So I hope that covered some of the questions that we need to cover for that. Keep in mind that if we looked at the composition of these composts, we would see that those 13 mineral nutrients that are required for plant growth, typically we have a very nice blend. Sometimes they're a little bit high in phosphorus, most of the times they are, and maybe a little lower than nitrogen that we want. So we're going to use these to and supplement in a nutrient management plan those deficiencies. And so anyway, that's pretty much it, Sarah. I think that was my last slide.
Thanks, Dave. That was really important. We're really hoping with this webinar series to give people some easy to apply information and not just sort of the 5,000 foot view. So that was really helpful. Oh, looks like you got one more, Dave. You want to jump in on this?
Sure, you bet. I just want to show that the application is very important too, and uniformity and calibration of that application is very important. If you look down here at this one section that says agriculture, just want to focus on that. General field soil amendments for specialty crop production, use of compost. They typically recommend somewhere in that 1 to 2 inch of application rate. And then the important part of that is to incorporate. And to get to that 5 to 8 inch depth, we typically need more than just a harrow or a disc. We're talking about a plow or maybe a rototiller to get that well mixed within that what we call the plow layer. And so incorporation is very critical for the use of these products. And that 1 to 2 inch of product on the surface, you can kind of see it there. That's probably pretty close to about an inch application, I'd say, in that spreader. And so you're covering the ground pretty well with an inch of compost. And that usually work out to around, depending on the product, around 12 ton per acre to get that good 1 inch. So you really don't want to typically go over that on an acre basis to get, and to really stay within, use that product judiciously and stay within the parameters of your nutrient management plan. So I recommend that about 1 inch coverage, which is very thorough coverage across the top of a well composted product, and then incorporate that to the 5 to 8 inch depth. And of course, do that timely enough so that you can legally plant your vegetable crops. And there's the Mid-Atlantic Better Composting School, canceled this year, but University of Maryland, Virginia Tech do a great job. If you want to become a master composter and compost and become certified to do such, if you're generating compost, I'd certainly recommend that. Sarah?
That's great. Thank you. All right, back to a couple handling tips. And Dave's staying with us here throughout. So if you have any questions for him or myself as we go, feel free to type them in the chat. So we have to handle these soil amendments carefully. We have to handle them in a way where they don't become a source of contamination. So here's some considerations for how you can do that on your operation. You could use dedicated equipment, and I know that's not always the most popular recommendation because it can require purchasing additional equipment, but the equipment that's in this picture here, not expensive equipment necessarily, separate shovels, rakes, that type of thing. If you're doing that type of on-farm composting like Dave was just talking about, can be an easy way to prevent the spread of contamination, just to have segregated tools that are just for handling soil amendments. How are you going to be able to express to your staff or the other folks that work on your farm which tools are for the soil amendments and which tools are for the produce fields? Doesn't have to be complicated. You could paint the tip of the shovel. You could use a piece of colored tape so that those tools do become dedicated to those particular uses. Can consider having specific gloves, having your workers wear specific boots when they're handling soil amendments as well. And obviously, and I know this is more a part of all of our lives than ever, but always a good idea to be washing your hands after you're after you're handling soil amendments. So make sure that when you're doing your annual worker trainings, or if you need to do a refresher, if you're planning on applying some soil amendments this fall, good thing to do is just to have a separate little worker training session about washing hands. If you remember back, if you were part of our worker training webinar in this series, or you remember it from a previous produce safety rule training course, it is a requirement of the produce safety rule that workers receive training specific to what they're doing on the farm. And that can be a little daunting sometimes because a lot of folks have just been using maybe the Cornell training video or used to just doing one uniform training for all the workers. This is an area that would be a great example of, if you have workers who are handling these amendments, give them a specific, doesn't have to be long or complicated, but a specific soil amendment training, and make a record of that. And then you've fulfilled that obligation under the produce safety rule as well. So consider the flow of the traffic from that soil amendment storage area into the produce fields or into the packing house, vice versa. So do you have, like is in this picture here, do you have a gator type piece of equipment, any other type of equipment that's going between these two areas? Do you have equipment that you need to clean and sanitize because it's going from these two traffic areas? So just think about the traffic flow from the different areas, what equipment's going between the two, and if you do have things like a gator that's going between the two, incorporating some cleaning and sanitizing regimes to prevent that cross-contamination. Again, training your workers about the potential routes of this type of contamination, reducing the risks, and how to report problems. So if they see something that they think could be a potential source of contamination, make sure that that's a part of their training, that they alert the farm operator to that. All right, so application. In order to talk about application of these soil amendments, we first have to figure out what kind of soil amendment we're dealing with. So are we dealing with a treated soil amendment or an untreated soil amendment? Because the rules are very different. By rules, I really mean the law. So in order to be treated, a soil amendment has to be processed to completion to adequately reduce microorganisms of public health significance. So it can be treated in a variety of different ways. It has to be a scientifically valid, controlled process, but it can be physical, like a thermal treatment, chemical, biological, or a combination thereof. So a question that we get sometimes, do I have to test my soil amendment? The produce safety rule does not require the farmer to engage in microbial testing. There are microbial standards in the law. I'm happy to share those with any of you if you would like those. Some of the sources that Angela's putting in the chat box have those outlined. We didn't feel it was necessary to go into that level of scientific detail today because we just don't see farmers actually engaging in that type of testing. You can use any treatment process that's been validated to meet those standards. So the static or turned composting that Dave was talking about, if your operation follows one of those examples of the biological treatment process, so if you're doing turned or static composting, then you would not have to do any other process, but you do have to keep records of that, and we'll talk about that. I'll give you an example of what a record looks like. So untreated. So either you're having, there's only one of two choices, treated or untreated. So what are some examples of untreated? Untreated is simply, it may simply be a soil amendment that hasn't been processed to completion. So maybe you are creating your own compost and you weren't able to achieve those standards that Dave was describing. Maybe you bought some compost from a third party and you were under the impression that it was treated, but when you asked, you were not able to get evidence from that third party, and I'll talk about that in a few slides, what kind of evidence you need when you buy it from a third party, that it actually was treated to the standards that's required. So that'd be considered untreated. Treated can become untreated. So untreated soil amendments may be those that have become contaminated after they were treated. So maybe you made some compost that met the standards, or you bought some compost that met those treatment standards, and unfortunately it became contaminated after treatment. So an example of that would be, if you've witnessed birds defecating on a treated compost pile, or if you've witnessed your farm worker accidentally mixing those piles up. And that's the next example. Compost that's become recombined with untreated. So like we were talking about the importance of storing those treated and untreated piles separate, and potentially labeling them, whatever you need to do to make sure that there's not a recombination, because if there is a recombination, you had a treated product and now you have an untreated product. Another example is an agricultural tea made with biological materials of animal origin that contains an agricultural tea additive. And the last example of untreated is a soil amendment that has been combined with a hazard or has been associated with foodborne illness. So let's say you were making compost and then unfortunately your farm became involved in a recall process. Your food was found to be the source of foodborne illness. If that compost pile contains that food, that would then be considered an untreated soil amendment. So here's the application table to kind of break down the application standards after you've decided whether what you're dealing with is treated or untreated. So for untreated soil amendments, and you have to look at the application type. So how are we applying these? So if you're applying untreated soil amendments in a way that does not contact produce during the application, and in a way that minimizes the potential for contact after the application, then the produce safety rule is actually at the point now where they're still reviewing what the right actual interval for this is going to be. However, and we'll get to this, so this is kind of a stay tuned moment for the produce safety rule. In the draft version of this rule, they proposed something that the agricultural community and others gave FDA the feedback that it really wasn't going to work. So FDA has gone back to the drawing board on this, but where they are now is that the best practice is to use the organic program standards of the 120-day rule. So basically, for an untreated soil amendment, if it's incorporated into the soil a minimum of 120 days prior to harvest, if the edible portion of the crop has soil contact. So if the edible portion of the crop doesn't have soil contact, then it needs to be incorporated into the soil a minimum of 90 days prior to harvest. So important to keep track of that. I will give you a sample of a record at the end here that will help you keep track of that. So if you're using untreated soil amendments and you're following that organic program standard, that's fine for now. We will definitely keep everybody up to date if FDA comes up with a different standard, a new standard for the produce safety rule. That's the best practice now, but it does require the farmer to do some record keeping to make sure that they have actually been using those standards. So for an untreated soil amendment, if it's not going to contact produce during or after application, then there is no applicable time interval. For treated, there's two different standards here. So there's the two different ways that you can have treated compost. If you have treated compost where you're going to have you're going to get it from a third party and you're going to have a certificate of conformance, then there's no restrictions on your application method or time interval. So you have a valid certificate of conformance. That's your evidence that that amendment has been treated to those scientific standards. If you're creating your own treated compost, the application method is to minimize the potential for produce contact during and after. So applying composted manure that you produced correctly, and the time interval on that one is also unrestricted. Okay, so just a couple other considerations, and these are things that these aren't directly within the produce safety rule, but definitely important things to keep in mind and things that we see popping up in Maryland, like Dave was saying, we have some diverse operations. And obviously, you've got neighboring operations who can be doing very different things. So consider how your soil amendments are being used on adjacent fields or farms. So whether, maybe they're fields or farms you're farming or leasing, handling, operating, that type of thing, or maybe it's just your neighbor. But is your field going to be, your produce field, is it going to be vulnerable to runoff from those areas? So obviously, we all want to prevent contamination. You can't necessarily control how your neighbors operate their farm, but I think it is worth considering and maybe, having a conversation with them about how soil amendments could be applied on their farm in a way that would reduce runoff into your farm. Consider anticipated rain events that could contribute to splash after application. So, we were just talking about the application standards. That's, those are the minimum standards, but obviously you want to take into consideration, if we can anticipate some major weather events, we don't want to be applying soil amendments prior to that, where it's going to increase the chance of runoff. Biosolids. So we get this question quite a bit. So human waste, and again, it's not within the definition of biological soil amendments, but wanted to talk about it since it's kind of in the neighborhood here of what we're discussing. So human waste is prohibited for growing covered produce, except for sewage sludge biosolids. So in Maryland, the ag land application of biosolids is going to be regulated by the Maryland Department of the Environment. So there's a difference between the different types of biosolids, which is really important. Class A biosolids can be applied without any data harvest restriction for produce. Class B biosolids, very different story. So there can be no production of crops to be eaten raw produce, is what we're talking about here, at least 3 years after Class B biosolids have been applied. So keep it in mind, understand the class of biosolids you're dealing with, and be careful about applying Class B biosolids to an area where you think there could be future vegetable, fruit, produce production. Okay, so I know this is not everybody's favorite topic, but it's an important requirement of the produce safety rule to keep records. So for a soil amendment that you're producing, for that on-farm composting that Dave described, you need to document the treatment process. So time, temperature, and turnings. The Produce Safety Alliance has created this sample record. You don't have to use this template. It's recommended because it has all of the required information for the produce safety rule. So for example, all of your records need to have the complete address of the farm. They need to have the person's name who created the record, the date of the record, some things that you might not necessarily include on a record if you were just trying to come up with your own form. So this is an example of what you would need. It needs to be kept for 2 years. It can be kept in paper form. It can be kept in an electronic form. That is up to the record keeper, as long as it's something that you could produce to the Maryland Department of Ag if they were doing a inspection, or the Federal Food and Drug Administration if they were doing an inspection. Okay, so what about those soil amendments that you buy from a third party? Well, here's the requirement in the law that you have to have proof of the process used to treat the amendment, that it was a scientifically valid process, that it's been carried out with one of those appropriate process monitoring systems, and that that amendment has been handled, conveyed, and stored in a way that's going to minimize the risk of contamination. So the FDA requires that, or provides rather, that a certificate of conformance, and I've referred to that throughout here, I'll show you an example here on the next slide, is what you need to fulfill that requirement for things you buy from a third party. It needs to be updated annually. So if you buy from the same person year after year, you need to get a new certificate of conformance each year. If you buy soil amendments and you're unable to get a certificate of conformance, best course of action is just to handle that soil amendment as if it were untreated. Here's an example of a certificate of conformance. It needs to state the processing method and the handling requirements like I just went over. So this is from the Produce Safety Alliance. It's a model certificate of conformance. The MDE rather, the Maryland Department of the Environment has a list of licensed composters, and that's available online, so we can share that link with you as well, just so you can make sure that you're buying from folks that would be accustomed to complying with this. Some additional records to consider. So these are not required, but these are things to consider. So as I mentioned, if you're using those organic standards, the organic application 90, 120-day standards, you're going to want to keep a record of the application, application method, type, harvest date. So this is a sample that you don't have to use, but it's just a sample of what that type of a record would look like. And so this would just be, you know, if anyone ever questioned you whether you properly followed those organic standards, you would have a record proving that you did. And this form does not have the address of the farm on there, which is something that's required by the produce safety rule. So just add the address if you're going to be using this. For the purchases from a third party for amendments, you might want to note where and when you bought the amendments, the name and address of the supplier, the date and amount purchased. Those might be in your regular business records. If they're not, worth noting that in your records, just so you would have that information. If there was an investigation and you had to go back many months, I don't know if you're anything like me, but I necessarily wouldn't remember, probably wouldn't remember the date I bought it, or maybe not the total amount purchased. So good to make a note of it. And then handling and sanitation practices you've used to reduce risks. So if you've done the worker trainings, we've recommended definitely make a note of that for your worker training requirement. If you've taken other steps on your farm, good idea to make some notes of it so you can refer back to those. Standard operating procedures. So one of our goals with this webinar series was to break down the various components of the produce safety rule and recommend as we go some of those SOPs that folks can then draft and utilize into a farm food safety plan. Next month is our last one of the series, and we're going to be focusing specifically on how you create that food safety plan. Here are some recommended standard operating procedures related to biological soil amendments. You could have one on how to make compost using a validated method, how to spread treated or untreated soil amendments, how to clean up equipment, clean and sanitize equipment. So again, you're going to want to put things in the plan that you're actually using on your farm. So, you have to customize this for your own operation. You don't want to do standards of procedure for things that aren't actually happening on your farm. You don't want it to be an aspirational plan. You want it to just be reflective of what you're actually doing. But these are some suggestions, and tune in next month and we'll give you some more specifics on that. What's next for this topic? We may see in the near future the FDA come out with some more specifics about using those untreated soil amendments. So they may come up with a standard that's different from those organic standards. So we'll just have to stay tuned for that. We'll definitely do our best to let everybody know. Here's all the references, all the different things that I used to come up with this presentation. I'm happy to share these with you. Angela's shared most of these as we went today, but if anybody wants a copy of my slides, I'm happy to also provide that. So November 20th is the date for the last webinar, putting it all together and creating your food safety plan. You can register today. And that is all I have today. We are definitely available for questions if anyone has any.
Thank thank you so much, Sarah, for such a wonderful webinar. And thank you also, Dave Myers. I think we provided a lot of really good information and applicable information to our participants today. Please tune in next month in our last installment, and you can get this recording sometimes in the next few weeks. I hope everyone has a safe and healthy weekend. And until next time, guys, goodbye.